Welcome back everyone to our studies in GCSE history. We're going to spend some time in this lesson talking about the role, the lifestyle and the importance of Native Americans when we think about the belief in manifest destiny and the sort of expansion and the intersection, if you will, between the settlers from the old world coming into the new world versus the already existing Native Americans who lived there. Now, of course, the way of life for the Native Americans, sometimes historically called the Indians, given the fact that I believe the reason for that was because when the explorers went to go and discover the New World, they believed they'd actually landed in India. They didn't know that America was a thing that existed. But regardless, the Native Americans' way of life was deeply interconnected with land and resources that was provided. So we're going to spend some time talking about the importance of bison. We'll talk about the importance of social structures and spiritual practices, and think about often how Native Americans were able to adapt to the challenging environments that existed on the Great Plains in ways that were probably far more successful than that of this idea of manifest destiny of the sort of old, the old world and the sort of new settlers. So beginning first then, we spent some time already thinking about the sort of geography and the environment of the Great Plains of the majority of America at this time. We know that we see that the Great Plains stretch from the Rocky Mountains in the west all the way to the Mississippi River in the east. And from north to south, they go as high as Canada all the way down to modern-day Texas. So quite a large space of land. Now, the region's climate is particularly harsh. We have very long, very cold winters, with also very hot and very dry summers. So the sort of the two extremes of climate we see on the Great Plains. Its terrain varied from sort of rolling grasslands to more rugged, arid regions as well. And so this environment then, if we think about the people who lived in this environment, we have to think about how this environment influenced the ways in which the Native Americans actually lived their lives. Well, they would have to live their lives in a way that would be influenced quite heavily by the environment, from their nomadic lifestyle to their social organization. And one of the central features of this social organization, and one of the central important features of the way of life for Native Americans, is of course the influence and the importance of bison on the Great Plains. Bison was the most important resource for the Native Americans on the Great Plains, given that it provided them with both food, it provided them with clothing, it provided them with shelter, it provided them with tools, and even in some circumstances it provided them with spiritual sustenance as well. They were central to their existence, and it can be said that their way of life was built around the influence of bison. So in terms of for food and resources and clothing and things like that, the tribes of the Great Plains would use a number of different hunting techniques. They were expert hunters and developed quite innovative techniques for tracking and hunting bison particularly. Early on, they would use sort of makeshift bow and arrows, but after the introduction of horses by the Spanish in the 17th century, they became highly skilled mounted hunters. So they would basically utilize some of the very few, admittedly, benefits of the settlers coming into this region to help benefit their own ways of life. The introduction of the horse then would transform the way of life for Native Americans on the Great Plains, particularly when it comes to, of course, making it possible to hunt larger herds more efficiently. The tribes would also use several methods to hunt bison. One of the common techniques was known as the buffalo jump, where large groups of hunters would stampede the bison over a cliff, a practice that's particularly common as part of the sort of Native Americans' way of life on the Great Plains. And so from there, you can hunt. There were hunting techniques, but there was also utilization, of course. So the use of basically every single part of the animal was very, very important, and it meant for very, very efficient use of use of their hunting, so efficient return, shall we say, on the amount of hunting that they would have to do. So every single part of the bison was used. Meat was dried and smoked into foods for winter, providing a crucial food source. Hides were used and made into clothing, teepees and shields. Bones were carved into tools such as knives, scrapers, and fish hooks, and even the sort of tendons of bison, the sinew of bison, was used as ways of stringing and sewing to make bows and arrows. So basically, every single thing that you can see on the bison was used in one way or another for effective management and lifestyle. It's also important to realise that the bison was an important cultural symbol. It had profound spiritual significance for many of the tribes on the Great Plains. They were revered by many as sacred animals, often involved in creation myths and religious rituals. So, obviously, this makes sense, given that when we think about the sort of spirituality in the of all kind of sort of nomadic tribes, they tend to be centered around the thing that is the most beneficial to them in terms of their lifestyle. And the bison, of course, was very, very important, and so it almost elevated itself to a spiritual level. So, as I just mentioned, a nomadic lifestyle, the vast open plains with their sparse natural resources dictated the lifestyle of the Native Americans on the Great Plains. Unlike sedentary farming societies, for example, the plains Native Americans needed to follow bison herds, which migrated with the seasons. So basically, bison would move throughout the land, and so their homes and settlements were designed to be mobile. And this is where we get to things like the quintessential dwelling of the Native Americans, the sort of stereotypical teepee. These were made with wooden poles and covered with bison hides, designed for easy assembly and easy disassembly, allowing the tribes to pack up and to move more effectively. The shape was a cone, which was ideal for shedding the wind and rain, and its interior was well suited for close-knit family groups. The size could vary, of course, depending on the number of people it needed to shelter and depending on the size of the hide that it was being used to cover. But it would be typically large enough to house small groups and even some cases extended families. The Plains Native American tribes also generally organized into small mobile bands and clans. So these bands would usually consist of extended families, again, operating autonomously but coming together in large gatherings for defense purposes against settlers, for example, and against hunts. The band structure was facilitated cooperation and the effective distribution of resources. And so within all this nomadic lifestyle, of course, spirituality is a very important feature of Native Americans' way of life during this period. So we see that the spiritual life of Native Americans was intimately tied to nature, particularly land, the animals, and the elements. And so religious belief often revolved around beliefs such as animism, which is the belief that all living things have spirits, including plants, animals, and in some circumstances even things like rocks having spirituality. A number of case studies can be seen. So we can see, for example, the Sundance, the most significant religious ceremonies on the Native American plains, was performed to renew tribal strength and also to make offerings to great spirits and to ensure that there are successful hunts and battles. So in a similar way that people in the Western world, let's say, would or at least in the East, in comparison to this, like people in Europe would pray for great spirit, for strength, for successful battles, for successful hunts. Things like the Sundance was the sort of Native American equivalent. It was a highly ritualistic event, often involving fasting, dancing, drumming, and the piercing of flesh. Many Plains tribes would also practice things like vision quests as part of spiritual practices. These involved individuals, often being young men, going out into the wilderness for periods of isolation to seek spiritual guidance. Again, a similar kind of thing. And as we've already mentioned, we know already that there was the use or the admiration or the veneration of spiritual animals. Bison was not the only animal that was revered by the Plains Native Americans. Animals like the eagle, for example, were also sacred to many tribes, and eagle feathers were worn as symbols of strength and bravery. In terms of these different tribes, then, one of the things that we haven't really mentioned is what about the relationship between different tribes? Well, despite their relatively independent lifestyles, there was often engagement with quite complex trade networks among each of these different tribal relations. So we see, for example, tribes trading in essential goods such as tools, weapons, clothing, foodstuffs, for example. The most valuable trade item in the early years was the horse. When the horse was introduced by the Spanish early on in the sort of 1600s, we can see that this was a revolutionary introduction for the Native Americans. As I mentioned earlier on, it was one of the very, very, very few benefits of settlers coming to the New World. Horses would revolutionize the culture of the Great Plains and provide for greater mobility and for the ability for people to hunt more effectively, essentially. So we see that Plains tribes would start to have complex relationships with each other. Some tribes were allies and would collaborate in hunting or in warfare, for example. We see that there are various different examples of this taking place. And really, when we get to the influence of the Europeans, when we see the arrival of European settlers and traders, the Plains Native Americans began to gain access to new trade goods. So things like metal tools and firearms and blankets. This led to new dependencies, however, on European goods, which altered the dynamics of intertribal relations, essentially bringing in a whole new dynamic, a whole new world, basically, literally a whole new world into this quite delicate social and cultural and economic balance would, of course, cause quite significant disruptions. We know already that disease would be a major factor in why Native Americans across the entire continent were all but wiped out. But also, of course, you have the fact that there was a lot of settler violence. And we start to see that even things that aren't necessarily intended to cause disruptions, like trading in goods and firearms, would definitely do so. And like I said already, and have been saying, that the things like the horse are of course, an example of having a major impact in the way of life of these Native Americans. Finally, then, what about the role of women and the gender dynamics that existed? Well, gender roles within Native American societies were generally distinct, but women would play a central role in maintaining social and economic fabric of the tribe. So the Native American women were primarily responsible for domestic tasks, such as cooking and tending to children. However, they would also hold quite significant power in decision-making, especially decision-making in areas of family matters and resource distribution. This is something that is slightly different and sets Native American groups quite a lot apart from the European settlers. In many tribes, women owned the family belongings, for example, and their voices were the primary voices that are heard at sort of tribal meetings. In many tribes, women also wielded quite a lot of political and spiritual power. Women served as spiritual leaders, or sometimes known as medicine women, and their cultural roles were in things like cultural preservation and healing practices were quite essential. So we see that also in some societies, in some tribal societies, the lineage and inheritance is passed through the mother's side, which is of course very different to patriarchal organizations in some of the European settlers, but also in other parts of Native American lifestyle, where you see more patriarchal systems, where women did not have so much authority over decisions of lineage and inheritance.